United States President Donald Trump ordered 2 nuclear submarines positioned closer to Russia in response to the nuclear rhetoric of former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Well, today Donald Trump also added, quote, "We are ready for a nuclear conflict with Russia." This move became the culmination of a war of words that unfolded on social media. And in fact, Trump ordered nuclear weapons to be aimed at Russia so that the Kremlin would know they are in the crosshairs. Nevertheless, this very news raises the main question. Why does Trump need all this? And why did some ordinary Russian official provoke such a reaction from the entire American president? And here, experts name several reasons at once. One of them is that Trump wants to present himself as tougher and more decisive on the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine, when the deadlines are already coming to an end. And another reason is that Trump now wants to distract the attention of the American public from the new tariffs against India and China, which he promised to introduce as early as August 80. After all, they will inevitably hit the United States themselves as well. So why did Trump really decide to respond to the Russians by actually moving nuclear submarines in response to Medvedev's drunken ramblings? Let's figure it out together in this episode. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 3rd. Next, let's go through everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, I think you have already heard about this news, so I won't dwell on it for long, and we'll quickly move on to the analysis. To put it very briefly, Medvedev, who previously called the United States' demands for a ceasefire a step towards war, threatened a nuclear strike in case of escalation. In response, Donald Trump sent closer to the Russian Federation huge submarines exposing Moscow's nuclear bluff. Despite the provocative nature of the United States' actions, the Kremlin is so far refraining from an official response, although it always acts symmetrically. And most often, the Kremlin would have already responded in kind, for example, by threatening with some warheads that are supposedly aimed at America. Right now, it's staying silent. And now American analysts interpret this silence from the Kremlin as a sign of diplomatic maneuvering by Putin, who probably still does not want a real escalation with Washington. Meanwhile, pro-Kremlin commentators and propagandists in the Russian media mocked Trump's decision, calling it hysteria and meaningless chatter. They said, "We don't care about your nuclear submarines." Experts point out that the main goal of the United States maneuver is to put pressure on Putin, who has so far not shown any willingness to make concessions regarding the war against Ukraine. If there is no progress by August 8, Trump promises new sanctions and trade restrictions, this time against Moscow's allies. Against this backdrop, Russia's main alcoholic Dmitry Medvedev, who once positioned himself as a reformer, he is looking more and more like a marginal figure. He seeks attention through such provocative statements, which, according to rumors, may be connected to his personal bad habits. Let me remind you that last year, The Insider reported that Medvedev's most awkward social media posts appeared shortly after new shipments from a Tuscan vineyard arrived at his Moscow address. Well, hinting that he got drunk and wrote those posts. Rumors that Medvedev drinks have been spreading for more than 10 years and are getting louder as his outbursts intensify. And there are also shots where he just falls asleep at a number of official events. Well, obviously, while being intoxicated. Alcohol may partially explain his transformation into this kind of marginal Kremlin jester, but it's more likely that he just craves attention. And Trump just gave him that attention, even if he called Medvedev a loser. Nevertheless, Medvedev got his share of attention from the American president. So the situation is that Trump has announced a new ultimatum to Putin regarding the war in Ukraine. In response, Medvedev began discussing a potential war with the United States. He specifically noted that each new ultimatum is a threat and a step toward war not between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and the United States. Trump called Medvedev a loser, but for some reason stated that the United States would deploy nuclear submarines. And today he added that they are actually ready for a nuclear confrontation with Russia. Trump explained that he ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be deployed in the appropriate areas. In case the stupidity, the foolish and provocative statements of former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev turn out to be something more. Well, all of this looks a little strange, and I'll explain why. It's even somewhat indecent that some minor Russian official, who is also an alcoholic, even if he's a former pseudo-president of a pseudo-country, managed to provoke Donald Trump. Of course, Trump put this Medvedev in his place, showed that he can actually take action, while the main alcoholic of Russia can only spit saliva on social media. But if you take away all these emotions, the President of the United States allowed himself to appear irritated in response to what he himself called Medvedev's empty nuclear statements. Who hasn't influenced decision-making in Russia for a long time now? A logical question arises: why is Trump even interfering in what he himself called foolish statements and responding with such a sharp public reaction that escalates the rhetoric between Washington and Moscow and has an impact? Here, it's worth remembering that right now, as this whole story with nuclear threats is unfolding, his special envoy Steve Witkoff is visiting Moscow and is trying to negotiate something with the Russians regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. The threat of sanctions and tariffs against China and India has not yet had the desired effect, and the 10-day deadline ends in just 5 days, even less. Well, at least publicly, Moscow hasn't expressed any concerns, and it's the public reaction now that influences how the world perceives Donald Trump's threats. That's why one possible explanation for why Trump acted the way he did in response to what he himself said. Medvedev's empty threats are an attempt to appear tough on the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine, by attacking Maria Netoknoho and at the same time avoiding direct confrontation with the real power in the Kremlin, represented by the dictator Vladimir Putin. At the same time, without changing the actual nuclear policy of the United States of America. Why do I say that moving 2 nuclear submarines does not change the actual nuclear doctrine of the United States of America? The fact is that American nuclear submarines are actually constantly patrolling the oceans 24/7, carrying hundreds of nuclear warheads, and are capable of striking targets in Russia from a great distance. Therefore, this redeployment that Trump announced is unlikely to actually change anything at all. Well, I mean, if the moment comes when it's really necessary to strike Moscow with nuclear weapons, there's no need to move submarines for that, let alone announce it publicly. They are already at full combat readiness. And here we come to something else. The escalation of nuclear rhetoric by Donald Trump could be a tactical distraction. And if that's the case, then there's one big advantage for Ukraine and its partners and a big disadvantage for Russia and its partners. Against the backdrop of threats of secondary tariffs against China and India for buying Russian oil, which could also have a negative effect on the United States itself, talk about nuclear weapons could shift public attention. Let me explain what I mean. So do you mean that Donald Trump's statements about increasing nuclear readiness against Russia could overshadow the problems that might arise soon if Trump actually imposes secondary tariffs against China and India? After all, that would be a sacrifice in the name of America's honor. Like, you can't just threaten the United States like that. So yes, there will be problems in the oil market, and maybe this will somehow affect American consumers. But we can endure this whole situation because this is a confrontation with Russia, which suddenly dared, even in the person of Medvedev, to directly threaten the United States of America. On the other hand, creating such messages for society may indicate that Trump has indeed decided to introduce these secondary tariffs against China and India. After all, Putin clearly shows no signs of being ready for real peace, and Trump simply has to act now. Otherwise, his own ultimatum will become his own failure. Overall, experts assure that although the nuclear rhetoric between the United States and Russia is causing concern, there is currently no real threat of nuclear confrontation. The relationship between Washington and Moscow, although tense, is still very far from direct conflict. And flirting with nuclear themes on social media does not yet signal a real escalation. Therefore, the reasons for Donald Trump's behavior should be sought precisely in the actions he has announced. And in the coming days, it will become clear whether this tactical ploy by the American president will work. So I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this video. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.